Growing up on a farm had its ups and downs, but for the most part, it was a peaceful, idyllic existence. That all changed one summer when I turned 15. My family had lived on this land for generations, and the old barn was a central fixture of our farm life. However, I never expected the terror that the barn would bring into my life. The barn was an imposing structure, weathered by time and the elements. Its wooden beams were dark and worn, the red paint peeling in places to reveal the raw wood beneath. Inside, the air was always cool, even on the hottest days, and the smell of hay and old wood was omnipresent. The barn had 2 levels, the ground floor where we kept the livestock and stored hay, and a loft above that was used for storage. The loft was accessible by a narrow, rickety ladder. Up there, dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced through the cracks in the walls. It was a place we rarely ventured, filled with old equipment and forgotten relics from our farm's history. It started with the animals. They became restless, refusing to enter the barn at dusk. Our cows and horses would balk at the entrance, their eyes wide with fear. We had to force them inside, and even then, they would huddle together, uneasy and alert. We brushed it off as nothing more than animal instinct. But then I began hearing noises. At first, it was just the creaking of the barn settling, or so I thought. But the creaking soon turned into footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that echoed through the barn when no one else was inside. I would rush in, expecting to find someone, but the barn was always empty. One evening, I decided to investigate. It was a typical summer night, and my parents were in the house watching TV. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the barn. The animals were already inside, their unease palpable. I turned on the flashlight and climbed the ladder to the loft, determined to find the source of the noises. The loft was a cluttered mess. Old tools, crates, and barrels were piled haphazardly, creating shadows that seemed to move and shift in the flickering light. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pressed on. As I moved deeper into the loft, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, whispers, and the faint sound of music, like an old gramophone playing a haunting tune. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response. I reached the back of the loft, where an old trunk sat covered in dust. The music was louder here, almost as if it was coming from inside the trunk. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch, before finally mustering the courage to open it. The trunk was empty, but the music continued. It was then that I felt it, a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to get down the ladder, nearly falling in my haste. I burst out of the barn, gasping for breath, and ran back to the house. My parents were startled by my appearance, and I told them everything. They were skeptical, but my dad agreed to check the barn with me. We went back out, and he searched the loft thoroughly, finding nothing out of the ordinary. The next few nights were uneventful, and I began to doubt my own experience. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild in the darkness. But then, the real terror began. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the music again. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting in through my open window. I got up and looked outside, and there, in the moonlight, I saw a figure standing by the barn. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinguishable. I watched in horror as it slowly turned and walked into the barn. I woke my parents, and we went outside together. The barn door was open, and the animals were agitated. We entered cautiously, my dad carrying a baseball bat for protection. The music was gone, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. We searched the entire barn, but there was no sign of the figure I had seen. We decided to call the local sheriff, who came out to investigate. He found no evidence of anyone else on the property and suggested it was just a prank or my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. The figure, the hand on my shoulder, the music, it was all too real. The sheriff promised to keep an eye on the place, and for a while, things were quiet. But the unease never left. Every creak and groan of the barn sent chills down my spine. I began to avoid it, doing my chores quickly and leaving as soon as possible. One evening, a few weeks later, my parents went into town, leaving me alone on the farm. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard the music again. It was louder this time, unmistakable. I grabbed a knife and went to the window, my heart pounding. The figure was there again, standing in front of the barn. It looked up at the house, and I could feel its gaze on me. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. The figure moved, slowly walking towards the house. I called the sheriff, my voice trembling, and he promised to come right away. I locked all the doors and windows and hid in the pantry, clutching the knife. I could hear the footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. They stopped at the front door, and I held my breath, waiting. Minutes felt like hours, but finally, I heard the sound of the sheriff's car pulling up. There were voices, a scuffle, and then silence. The sheriff knocked on the door, calling out to me. I emerged from the pantry, my legs weak with fear. The sheriff told me they had found no one. He promised to patrol the area more frequently, but the memory of that summer, and that haunting music, haunted me for years to come. Living in the countryside had always been a dream of mine. The fresh air, the wide open spaces, and the tranquility of rural life were things I had longed for, after years of living in the city. So, when my husband and I finally purchased our farmhouse, we were ecstatic. Little did we know, our dream would soon turn into a nightmare. The farmhouse was picturesque, surrounded by rolling hills and fields that seemed to stretch on forever. The house itself was a charming two-story building with white siding and green shutters. A large porch wrapped around the front, offering a perfect spot to enjoy the sunsets. The barn, slightly weathered but sturdy, stood a short distance away, nestled against a grove of trees. Inside, the house was cozy and welcoming. The kitchen was the heart of our home, with its old-fashioned stove and a large wooden table where we often gathered for meals. The living room was filled with comfortable furniture, and the fireplace added a warm glow on chilly evenings. Our bedroom was upstairs, offering a view of the fields and the distant mountains. It all started innocuously enough. We had been living in the house for a few months, settling into our new routine. One evening, as we were having dinner, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of our property, near the barn. It was hard to see in the fading light, but the silhouette was unmistakable. I mentioned it to my husband, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "Probably just a passerby," he said, brushing it off. I wanted to believe him, but something about the figure unsettled me. It was just the beginning. A few nights later, we were watching TV in the living room when we heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. My husband muted the TV, and we listened intently. The footsteps stopped, and there was a brief silence before we heard a knock at the door. My heart raced as my husband went to answer it. He opened the door to find no one there. Puzzled, he stepped outside and looked around but saw nothing. We decided it must have been an animal or the wind playing tricks on us. But as the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to dismiss. One night, we were awakened by the sound of our front door creaking open. We bolted upright, our hearts pounding. My husband grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the bed, and we cautiously made our way downstairs. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. We checked every room, but nothing seemed out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. We decided to install a security system, hoping it would give us some peace of mind. For a while, it seemed to work. The nights were quiet, and we began to relax. Then, one evening, we had some friends over for a barbecue. It was a beautiful day, filled with laughter and good food. As the sun set, we moved inside to continue the festivities. We were in the middle of a game of cards when the power suddenly went out. We fumbled for candles and flashlights, trying to make light of the situation. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. My husband and our friends went to investigate while I stayed with the others. The tapping moved from one window to the next, as if someone was circling the house. Our guests tried to reassure us, but I could see the fear in their eyes. The next morning, we found footprints in the mud around the house. They led from the barn to the windows and then disappeared into the field. We were on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders. We started locking all the doors and windows, even during the day. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. I nudged my husband awake, and we listened together. The whispering stopped, and there was a heavy silence. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, as if something had been thrown against the house. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. They found no evidence of forced entry, no signs of anyone nearby. It was as if our tormentor was a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will. The incidents continued, each one more disturbing than the last. One evening, as I was cooking dinner, I glanced out the window and saw the figure standing in the field again. This time, I could see more details, a tall, gaunt man with wild eyes and tattered clothes. He stared directly at me, his expression a mix of anger and madness. I screamed for my husband, and when we looked again, the man was gone. We were living in a state of constant fear, unsure of when or where he would strike next. The police increased their patrols, but it did little to calm our nerves. One night, we were awoken by the alarm blaring. We rushed downstairs to find the front door wide open. The security system had been tampered with, and the intruder was nowhere to be found. We called the police again, and this time they brought a K9 unit. The dog picked up a scent and led the officers to the barn. Inside, they found a makeshift bed and a collection of items stolen from our house. It was clear that someone had been living there, watching us, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The police assured us they would do everything they could to catch the intruder, but the damage was done. We no longer felt safe in our own home. The man was never caught, and the incidents eventually stopped. But the fear remained, a constant reminder of our vulnerability. We installed more security measures, and I found myself jumping at every noise. The peaceful life we had dreamed of was shattered, replaced by a lingering sense of dread. Living in the countryside was supposed to be our escape, our sanctuary. Instead, it became a place of fear and uncertainty. The memory of that gaunt, wild-eyed man still haunts me. I never thought I would be left alone on the family farm. It was a sprawling piece of land surrounded by dense cornfields. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the isolation was usually something I cherished. But that weekend, when my parents left for a long overdue vacation, the isolation took on a more sinister tone. When the night came, I went about my usual chores, feeding the chickens, checking the barn, and making sure everything was locked up tight. The house itself was old, with creaky floorboards and walls that seemed to groan with age. The wind whistled through the gaps in the windows, creating an eerie symphony that echoed through the empty rooms. The cornfield was another story. It stood tall and imposing, a sea of green that rustled ominously in the breeze. During the day, it was easy to dismiss the rustling as nothing more than the wind. But as night fell, the cornfield took on a life of its own. The tall stalks swayed and whispered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and reach for the house. The first strange noise came on the second night. I was in the living room, watching TV, when I heard a faint rustling outside. I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But the noise persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I turned off the TV and listened intently, my heart pounding in my chest. I got up and walked to the window, peering into the darkness. The porch light cast a weak glow, barely illuminating the edge of the cornfield. I saw nothing out of the ordinary and convinced myself it was just my imagination. I went back to the couch, but the unease lingered. The next day, I went about my chores as usual. I fed the animals, checked the fences, and made sure everything was in order. It was a warm, sunny day, and the farm seemed peaceful. I spent the afternoon reading a book on the porch, enjoying the solitude. As the sun began to set, I started to feel that familiar unease creeping back. That night, the noises returned. This time, they were closer. I heard the distinct sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. My heart raced as I turned off the TV and listened. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. I waited, my breath held, but the noise didn't start again. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a stray dog or a coyote. But then I heard the knocking. It was a soft, tentative knock at first, like someone tapping lightly on the door. I froze, unsure of what to do. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my phone and dialed my parents, but there was no answer. I was alone. I walked to the door, my hands shaking. I looked through the peephole but saw nothing. The porch light cast a dim glow, but the shadows were deep and impenetrable. The knocking continued, louder and more frantic. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. They assured me they would send someone out to check, but it would take time. I hung up and tried to calm myself, but the knocking persisted. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I sat on my bed, clutching my phone, and listened. The knocking had stopped, but I heard something else, a rustling sound, like someone moving through the cornfield. I looked out the window and saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the field, staring at the house. My blood ran cold. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was the same person who had been knocking. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Who was this person? What did they want? Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I kept glancing out the window, but the figure remained motionless. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. Relief washed over me as I heard the officers calling out, their voices cutting through the night. I ran to the front door and unlocked it, letting the officers in. They searched the property, but the figure was gone. The officers assured me they would patrol the area and keep an eye out, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They thought I was just a scared teenager with an overactive imagination. The police left, and I was alone again. I locked all the doors and windows, but sleep was impossible. Every noise, every rustle of the wind, sent my heart racing. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hyper-awareness, listening for any sign of the intruder. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the house, leading to the cornfield. I showed them to the police, but they said there was nothing they could do without more evidence. My parents returned later that day, and I told them everything. They were concerned but tried to reassure me that it was just a one-time occurrence. But the experience left a lasting impression. I never felt safe on the farm again, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that faint rustling in the cornfield. The figure never returned, but the fear never left. It lingered in the shadows, and I never forgot the night I was truly alone. When we bought the land, we were thrilled. My husband and I had always dreamed of building our own home, a place where we could raise our children and grow old together. The land was perfect, nestled in a quiet valley with rolling hills and a clear, babbling brook that cut through the property. It was a dream come true, or so we thought. The first time I saw the land, it took my breath away. The rolling hills were lush and green, dotted with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. The brook was crystal clear, its waters cool and refreshing. Tall, ancient trees bordered the property, their branches reaching towards the sky like the arms of giants. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. It was idyllic, the perfect setting for our new home. We spent the first few months planning and building, pouring our hearts into every detail. The house began to take shape, a beautiful two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and large windows that overlooked the valley. We envisioned our children playing in the fields, our family gathered around the table for meals, and quiet evenings spent watching the sunset. It started with small things, easily dismissed. Tools would go missing from the construction site, only to reappear in strange places. We would hear footsteps at night, but when we checked, no one was there. The workers began to complain of feeling uneasy, like they were being watched. We laughed it off, attributing it to the isolation and the long hours. But the unease grew. One evening, as we were finishing up for the day, I noticed something strange. In the fading light, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the property, near the brook. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure was tall and unmoving. I called out to my husband, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. He assured me it was probably a deer or a shadow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. We continued with our work, trying to ignore the strange occurrences. One Saturday, we decided to have a picnic by the brook. It was a beautiful day, the sun shining brightly and the sky a clear, brilliant blue. We spread out a blanket and enjoyed a meal of sandwiches and lemonade, laughing and talking about our plans for the future. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something on the ground where we had been sitting. It was a small, carved figurine, crudely made and weathered with age. It looked like a human figure, but its features were twisted and grotesque. I picked it up, feeling a chill run down my spine. My husband shrugged it off, saying it was probably just an old toy left by a previous owner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house made my heart race. I kept thinking about the figure I had seen and the strange figurine by the brook. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside our bedroom window. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving around the house. I woke my husband, and we both crept to the window. Peering out, we saw a shadowy figure standing by the barn. It was tall and unmoving, just like the one I had seen before. My husband grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. I watched from the window, my breath fogging up the glass. He shone the light around, but found nothing. The figure was gone, leaving only a sense of dread in its wake. The next morning, we found the barn door open and the inside ransacked. Tools were scattered everywhere, and several pieces of equipment were broken. It was as if someone had been searching for something. We called the police, but they found no evidence of a break-in. The officers suggested it might have been an animal, but we knew better. Something was wrong with this place. As the days passed, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. We would hear voices whispering in the night, strange lights flickering in the distance, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Our workers began to quit, unable to handle the constant fear and unease. We were left to finish the house on our own. One evening, as we were working late, we heard a scream from the field. It was a blood-curdling sound that sent shivers down my spine. We ran outside, but found nothing. The scream echoed in the air, lingering long after it had stopped. We decided to call it a night and went inside, locking all the doors and windows. That night, I had a terrible dream. I saw the figure again, standing by the brook. It was holding the carved figurine, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It whispered my name, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I knew we couldn't stay here any longer. We packed up our belongings and left the next day. As we drove away, I felt a sense of relief as we left, but also a lingering fear. What had we disturbed? What secrets did that land hold? We sold the house and the land, moving back to the city where we felt safer. But the memories of that place still haunt me. I often wonder what became of the new owners, if they experienced the same terror we did. I can only hope they were able to uncover the truth and find peace. Living on that cursed land changed us. The tranquility we sought turned into a nightmare, leaving us with a sense of dread that follows us to this day. The land may have been beautiful, but it held a darkness that we were never meant to encounter. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button for more terrifying tales. Don't miss our latest video, for disturbing true new house horror stories, where we uncover unsettling experiences that happened right after people moved into their new homes. These stories will make you rethink your dream house. See you in the next video.